Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the disturbing life of Aztec kings. So before you get too comfortable, hit that like button if you enjoy this kind of deep dive, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. It's good to know you and to feel that the work we put in is being seen. Now, dim the lights, maybe grab a snack, though you might lose your appetite once we get going, and let's jump in. Picture this. You wake up at dawn in the heart of Tenochtitlan. The year is 1519, and you're not just anyone. You're the Huitlacoche, the great speaker, the god king of the most powerful empire in the Americas. Your palace is larger than Versailles, your city more magnificent than Paris, and your empire spans from coast to coast. Sounds pretty sweet, right? Well, hold on to that thought, because in about 30 minutes, you're going to witness a human sacrifice that would make Game of Thrones look like a children's bedtime story. By noon, you'll be eating a meal that includes parts of your enemies, and by evening, you'll be participating in rituals so disturbing that Spanish conquistadors, men who burned people alive for heresy, would literally vomit at the sight. Welcome to the life of an Aztec king, where absolute power comes with absolutely horrifying responsibilities. Let's set the scene properly, because understanding just how insane the life of an Aztec king was requires understanding the world they lived in. You're standing on the roof of your palace in Tenochtitlan, and the sight before you would make your jaw drop, even by today's standards. This city, built on a lake in the middle of a valley, is home to over 200,000 people. That's bigger than London was at the time. It's bigger than any European city except possibly Paris. The engineering alone would impress modern architects. Massive causeways stretch across Lake Texcoco like ancient highways, connecting your island capital to the mainland. Aqueducts bring fresh water from mountain springs. Gardens literally float on the lake. They're called chinampas, and they're so productive they can feed your entire population. But here's where things get weird, and I mean really weird. As the Huitlacoche, you're not just a king, you're a god, literally. The Aztecs believed you were the earthly representative of Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and the sun. Every morning when the sun rises, it's because you've performed the proper rituals. Every victory in battle happens because you've pleased the gods. Every harvest depends on your divine favor. No pressure, right? But being a god king means you can't just do whatever you want. Oh no, that would be too easy. Instead, you're trapped in the most elaborate set of religious obligations and ceremonial restrictions ever devised by human beings. Let me give you an example of what your typical morning looks like. You wake up before dawn, not because you want to, but because the sun god demands it. You can't just roll out of bed and grab some coffee like a normal person. Instead, you have to perform a series of purification rituals that would make a modern spa treatment look casual. First, you bathe. But this isn't a relaxing soak. You're using water that's been blessed by priests, and you're washing with special soaps made from the root of the soapberry tree. Your servants, and you have hundreds of them, are scrubbing every inch of your body while chanting prayers. Then comes the bloodletting. Yeah, you heard that right. Every single day you have to pierce your earlobes, your tongue, or your penis with obsidian blades and let your divine blood drip onto bark paper that will later be burned as an offering to the gods. And you thought your morning routine was rough. The clothes you wear aren't clothes, they're religious vestments. Each piece has symbolic meaning. The feathered cloak represents your connection to the sky god Quetzalcoatl. The jade jewelry connects you to the earth. Even your sandals are special. They're made from jaguar hide, because the jaguar is the symbol of royal power. But here's the thing that would drive most modern people absolutely insane. You can never, ever be alone. Never, even when you're using the bathroom, which by the way, is a golden toilet because you're a god, and gods don't use regular toilets. There are servants standing guard. When you eat, there are dozens of nobles watching your every bite. When you sleep, guards are posted outside your door, and even your dreams are considered prophecies that need to be interpreted by priests. You want to take a walk? Too bad. You're carried everywhere on a litter, because your divine feet aren't supposed to touch the ground. You want to have a casual conversation with someone? Forget it. Everyone who speaks to you has to approach on their belly, crawling across the floor, never making eye contact. You're the most powerful person in an empire of 15 million people, and you have less personal freedom than a modern teenager. And we haven't even gotten to the really disturbing stuff yet. Alright, so you've completed your morning rituals. You're dressed in your divine outfit, and now it's time for breakfast. But this isn't going to be cornflakes and orange juice. Let me paint you a picture of the royal dining hall. We're talking about a room that could easily fit a modern basketball court, with ceilings so high they disappear into shadows. The walls are covered in murals depicting your ancestors' greatest victories, and by victories, I mean scenes of enemy cities being burned, captives being sacrificed, and tribute being collected. You're seated on a throne made of jaguar hide and precious metals, and spread before you is a feast that would make a modern Food Network show look like a gas station snack bar. There are dozens of different dishes. Chocolate, but not the sweet stuff you're thinking of. This is bitter, spicy, mixed with chili peppers and sometimes blood. There are turkeys prepared in ways that would boggle modern chefs. Fruits you've never heard of. Vegetables grown in those floating gardens I mentioned earlier. But then there are the other dishes. The ones that make Spanish chroniclers describe Aztec royal meals as abominable and against all Christian decency. Human meat. Yeah, we need to talk about this, because it's a huge part of understanding just how different the Aztec world was from anything we can imagine today. The Aztecs practiced ritual cannibalism, but it wasn't random or cruel. It was deeply religious and highly regulated. Only certain people could be eaten, only at certain times, and only in certain ways. The meat served at royal meals typically came from enemy warriors who had been captured in battle and sacrificed to the gods. These weren't just random prisoners. They were often high-ranking enemies, sometimes even rival kings. The Aztecs believed that by consuming their enemies, they literally absorbed their strength, their courage, and their knowledge. Your breakfast might include a stew made from the arms of a Tlaxcalan warrior who had fought bravely against your armies. The Aztecs believed that eating the flesh of a brave enemy would transfer his courage to you. It was the ultimate form of respect. In their minds, your enemy's strength would live on through you. But here's what really makes this disturbing from a modern perspective. It wasn't done in anger or hatred. It was done with reverence. Elaborate ceremonies preceded the preparation of these meals. Priests would bless the meat. Special cooking methods were used. The consumption was treated as a sacred act. And you, as the God King, didn't have a choice in the matter. This wasn't optional. Refusing to participate in these ritual meals would be like a Christian pope refusing to take communion. It would undermine your divine authority and potentially cause a religious crisis. So you sit there, in your golden dining hall, eating the flesh of your enemies while dozens of nobles watch and priests chant prayers, and you have to act like this is the most normal thing in the world, because to you, it is. Meanwhile, hundreds of servants are scurrying around, making sure your every need is met. They're tasting your food for poison. Yes, even god kings had to worry about assassination. They're adjusting the flowers in the room. They're burning incense to keep the air pure for your divine lungs. And outside, in the courtyards of your palace, other things are happening that would make modern people's skin crawl. After breakfast comes what the Spanish chroniclers politely called diversions, but which we might more accurately describe as things that would get you arrested in any modern country. See, as the God King, you don't just rule through fear or military might. You rule through spectacle. The people need to be constantly reminded of your divine power, your connection to the gods, and the consequences of defying you. So let's walk well, let's be carried, because your feet don't touch the ground, to the central courtyard of your palace for the morning's entertainment. The first thing you notice is the smell. It's a mixture of blood, copal incense, and flowers. The Aztecs were obsessed with flowers. They believed beautiful scents attracted the gods, but they were also obsessed with blood, which they believed fed the gods. The combination is ... unique. In the center of the courtyard stands a platform, and on that platform is a stone altar that's been stained dark red by centuries of use. This is where the morning sacrifices take place. Now, let me be clear about something. Human sacrifice wasn't rare in the Aztec Empire. It wasn't something that happened occasionally during major festivals. It happened every single day, multiple times a day, in hundreds of locations across the empire. Conservative estimates suggest that the Aztecs sacrificed between 20,000 and 250,000 people per year. That's not a typo. We're talking about numbers that would make Stalin jealous. But the scale isn't even the most disturbing part. It's the methods. This morning, you're going to watch a ceremony dedicated to Tzipatotec, the flayed lord, the god of renewal and rebirth. The prisoners, let's say they're warriors captured in a recent campaign against a rebellious city, are brought out naked, painted with sacred symbols, and forced to climb the steps to the altar. What happens next would make the most hardcore horror movie seem tame. The prisoner is held down by 4 priests, while a 5th uses an obsidian knife to cut open his chest and rip out his still beating heart. But that's just the beginning. After the heart is offered to the gods, the body is skinned completely. The skin is then worn by priests in a ritual dance that can last for days. The Aztecs believed that by wearing the skin of the sacrificed, the priests could embody the renewal that Tzipatotec represented. Picture that for a moment. You're sitting on your throne, watching grown men dancing around wearing the freshly removed skin of other human beings, while blood pools at the base of the altar, and the morning sun reflects off the obsidian knives, and you're expected to nod approvingly, because this isn't entertainment in the way we think of it. This is religious duty. These sacrifices ensure that the sun will rise tomorrow. They guarantee that the rains will come. They maintain the cosmic balance that keeps the universe from collapsing into chaos. At least, that's what everyone believes, including you. But let's say you're having doubts. Let's say that somewhere in the back of your mind, you're wondering if maybe, just maybe, there might be a better way to ensure cosmic stability than ripping out people's hearts. Too bad you can't express those doubts. You can't even think them too loudly, because the priests are watching your every reaction. Any sign that you're not fully committed to the religious traditions of your people could be interpreted as a sign that you're losing your divine connection. And a God King who's lost his connection to the gods is no longer a God King. He's just a target. So you sit there, watching the dance of the flayed priests, smelling the blood and the incense, and you nod your approval. You might even make a comment about how pleased the gods must be with such a fine offering. Meanwhile, your mind is already moving to the next item on your daily schedule. Because believe it or not, we're still in the morning, and there's so much more disturbing stuff ahead. Now let's talk about one of the most psychologically disturbing aspects of being an Aztec king: the absolute, crushing weight of divine responsibility. See, in most monarchies throughout history, kings ruled by claiming divine right, but they weren't actually considered gods themselves. If something went wrong, a plague, a famine, a military defeat, they could blame it on God's will, or on their advisors, or on their enemies. Not you, you are a god. When crops fail, it's because you haven't performed the proper rituals. When enemies win battles against your armies, it's because you've displeased the other gods. When diseases spread through your cities, it's because your divine power is weakening. The psychological pressure of this belief system would break most modern people within weeks. Imagine if every bad thing that happened in your country was considered your personal, direct fault. Imagine if natural disasters were seen as evidence that you were failing in your cosmic duties. Now imagine that the solution to most of these problems involves killing more people. Let me give you a real historical example. In 1454, there was a massive famine that lasted for years. The rains stopped coming, crops died, people starved in the streets of Tenochtitlan. The population was beginning to doubt whether their god-king still had divine favor. The solution: more human sacrifices, way more. The Aztec priests determined that the gods were angry because they weren't being properly fed. So Moctezuma I, the king at the time, ordered what they called the Flower Wars. These were elaborate military campaigns whose only purpose was to capture prisoners for sacrifice. Thousands upon thousands of people were killed in increasingly elaborate ceremonies. Hearts were torn out, bodies were flayed, prisoners were drowned, burned alive, shot with arrows, and thrown from the tops of pyramids. And when the rains finally returned, as they naturally would, after 4 years, everyone praised the king for restoring divine favor through his wise decision to increase the sacrifices. But here's the thing that would keep you awake at night. What if it hadn't worked? What if the rains hadn't returned? What if the famine had continued despite all the sacrifices? Then you would have been seen as a failed god-king. Your own priests would have turned against you. Your nobles would have plotted your assassination. Your people would have demanded a new ruler who could properly communicate with the gods. And the method of removing a failed god-king? Let's just say it involved more than a simple vote of no confidence. So every morning, when you wake up and perform your bloodletting rituals, you're not just going through the motions. You're desperately hoping that your blood offering will be enough to keep the gods happy. Every human sacrifice you order isn't just religious duty. It's a desperate attempt to maintain the cosmic balance that keeps you in power. And the worst part? You can never be sure it's working. Did the victory in last month's battle happen because your sacrifices pleased the war god, or because your generals are skilled? Did the good harvest come from divine favor, or just because it was a good year for rain? You'll never know. But everyone around you will interpret every event as either evidence of your divine connection or proof that you're losing it. Talk about performance anxiety. Let's move forward to afternoon, because that's when things get really interesting. And by interesting, I mean absolutely terrifying. As an Aztec god king, you're not just a religious figurehead. You're also the supreme military commander of one of the most efficient war machines in human history. The Aztec Empire wasn't built through diplomacy or trade agreements. It was built through systematic, religiously motivated conquest. But Aztec warfare was unlike anything that existed anywhere else in the world, because it wasn't primarily about killing your enemies. It was about capturing them alive for sacrifice. Think about how completely this changes military strategy. Modern warfare is about destroying the enemy's ability to fight. Ancient European warfare was about defeating the enemy army and seizing territory. But Aztec warfare was about capturing as many high-value prisoners as possible while minimizing your own casualties. This created a completely unique military culture that would seem insane by any other standard. Let me describe a typical military campaign from your perspective as God King. First, you don't just decide to attack someone because you want their land or their resources. You attack them because the gods demand more sacrifices, or because your priests have determined that cosmic balance requires the ritual death of enemies from a specific region. The campaign begins with religious ceremonies that last for days. Your warriors undergo purification rituals. They fast, they take hallucinogenic drugs, they participate in ritual bloodletting. By the time they march to war, they're in an altered mental state where they literally believe they're fighting alongside the gods. Your military strategy is based around elite warrior societies, the Eagle Warriors and the Jaguar Warriors, who are basically religious fanatics trained from childhood to be the most effective human hunters in history. These guys don't wear metal armor like European knights. Instead, they wear elaborate costumes designed to intimidate and confuse their enemies. Picture this: you're a warrior from a neighboring city, and suddenly you're facing an army where half the soldiers are dressed like giant eagles with feathered wings and curved beaks, while the other half look like humanoid jaguars with spotted pelts and snarling masks. Before you can even process what you're seeing, they're on you with obsidian-edged clubs that can cut through armor like it's paper. But here's the really disturbing part. They're not trying to kill you quickly. They're trying to knock you unconscious or wound you just enough that you can't fight back. Because dead warriors can't be sacrificed to the gods. Imagine the psychological effect of fighting an enemy who's trying to capture you alive for ritual torture and death. Imagine facing warriors who believe that killing you quickly would be robbing the gods of their rightful offering. And you, as the God King, are directing all of this from your litter, carried by priests and protected by your elite guard, watching your enemies being subdued and bound for transport back to Tenochtitlan. But the campaign isn't over when the battle ends. That's when the really disturbing stuff begins. Alright, so your army has been successful. You've captured, let's say, 500 enemy warriors from various cities that refused to pay tribute. Now comes the logistical challenge that no other empire in history had to deal with. How do you transport, house, feed, and prepare 500 people for elaborate ritual sacrifice? This isn't a simple matter of marching prisoners back to your capital. These people need to arrive in Tenochtitlan in perfect physical condition, because damaged goods aren't acceptable offerings to the gods. So you've got hundreds of captives who need to be fed, watered, and kept healthy during a march that might last weeks. You need guards to prevent escapes, but not so many guards that you're diverting resources from other military operations. And then there's the psychological aspect. These prisoners know exactly what's waiting for them. They've heard the stories. They know about the altars and the obsidian knives and the priests who wear human skin. Some of them try to escape. Some of them try to kill themselves. Some of them go catatonic with terror. Some of them try to attack the guards in hopes of dying in battle rather than on the altar. Managing this requires a level of systematic cruelty that would make Nazi concentration camp guards uncomfortable. The Aztecs developed an entire bureaucracy dedicated to processing human sacrifices. There were officials whose only job was determining which prisoners should be sacrificed to which gods. There were priests who specialized in different methods of killing. There were craftsmen who made the ceremonial knives and altars. There were even schedulers who organized the timing of different sacrifices to ensure that every god received their proper offerings on their proper feast days. By the time you returned to Tenochtitlan with your prisoners, The preparations are already underway. The altars have been cleaned and blessed. The obsidian knives have been sharpened. The priests have undergone their purification rituals. And you, as the God King, have to oversee all of it. Let me describe what a major sacrifice ceremony looks like, because the scale of these events was beyond anything most people can imagine. We're talking about the dedication of the temple of Huitzilopochtli, which happened during the reign of your predecessor, Ahuitzotl, in 1487, according to Spanish chroniclers, who had every reason to exaggerate, but whose numbers are supported by archaeological evidence. This ceremony involved the sacrifice of 80,400 people over 4 days. 80,000 people in 4 days. That's more than 20,000 people per day, more than 800 people per hour, more than 13 people per minute, every minute, for 4 days straight. The logistics alone would challenge a modern military. You need thousands of priests working in shifts. You need systems for disposing of that much human blood. You need to organize the bodies, some for ritual cannibalism, some for feeding to the animals in your zoo, some for burial. You need musicians to maintain the proper rhythm for the ceremonies. You need dancers to perform the appropriate rituals. You need guards to control the crowds of spectators who come from across the empire to witness this demonstration of divine power. And at the center of it all, you're sitting on your throne, covered in blood spray, watching an endless line of prisoners being dragged up the steps of the pyramid to have their hearts cut out while they're still alive, for 4 days, without a break, because taking a break would suggest that you're not strong enough to witness the gods receiving their proper tribute. Now, let's talk about something that doesn't get enough attention when people discuss the Aztec Empire. The economics of running a civilization that's based on systematic human sacrifice. See, all those prisoners don't just appear out of nowhere. All those elaborate ceremonies don't organize themselves. All those priests and warriors and bureaucrats don't work for free. The Aztec Empire was essentially a massive protection racket, but one justified by religious ideology rather than simple greed. Here's how it worked. Your armies would march into a new region and present the local rulers with a simple choice: submit to Aztec authority, pay regular tribute, and provide prisoners for sacrifice when demanded, or face total destruction. Most cities chose submission because they'd heard what happened to the ones that chose destruction. The tribute system was incredibly sophisticated and brutally efficient. Every subject city had to provide specific amounts of goods on specific schedules: corn, beans, cotton, precious metals, feathers, jewels, cacao, rubber, you name it. But the most valuable tribute wasn't material goods, it was people. Every subject city had to provide a quota of prisoners for sacrifice. Sometimes these were criminals or prisoners of war from their own conflicts. Sometimes they had to organize special raids against their neighbors just to meet their tribute obligations. And if they couldn't meet their quotas, well, then the tribute collectors would simply designate some of their own people to make up the difference. Imagine being a city official in a place like Tlaxcala, knowing that every year you have to hand over dozens of your own citizens to be transported to Tenochtitlan and ritually murdered. Imagine having to choose which families would lose sons and daughters to feed the Aztec gods. Now imagine that refusing to make these selections would result in your entire city being destroyed and your entire population being dragged away for sacrifice. This system created a perpetual cycle of violence and terror that kept the entire empire in line. Cities that had been conquered were forced to participate in conquering other cities, which were then forced to participate in conquering still more cities. It was brilliant, in a completely horrifying way. But here's what's really disturbing. It worked. For over a century, this system generated enough wealth and resources to support one of the largest cities in the world, fund massive construction projects, maintain huge armies, and create art and architecture that amazed even the Spanish conquistadors. Blood, as it turns out, was an incredibly effective currency. Let's take a break from mass murder for a moment and talk about one of the more unique aspects of Aztec royal life: your zoo. Now, when I say zoo, you might be picturing something like a modern wildlife preserve, with animals being cared for by trained professionals in naturalistic habitats. You would be very wrong. The Royal Zoo of Tenochtitlan was less like the San Diego Zoo and more like something out of a nightmare. It housed thousands of animals from across the empire, but its primary purpose wasn't conservation or education. It was disposal. See, all those human sacrifices we've been talking about. They produce a lot of bodies, and while some of those bodies are used for ritual cannibalism and others are buried or cremated, there's still the matter of what to do with all the leftover ... parts. The answer was your zoo. The Spanish chronicler Hernán Cortés described seeing many vipers and poisonous snakes which have on their tails a thing that sounds like bells. These, which are the fiercest, are kept in jars and great pottery vessels and given many feathers, and there they lay their eggs and rear their young. These snakes were fed human flesh from the sacrificial ceremonies. So were the jaguars, the pumas, the wolves, the eagles, and dozens of other predators. But it gets worse. The zoo also housed human beings. Spanish chroniclers reported seeing cages full of people who were being fattened up for sacrifice. Albinos were particularly prized because they were considered especially pleasing to certain gods. Hunchbacks and dwarves were kept for specific ceremonies. Children were housed separately and fed special diets to prepare them for sacrifice to the rain god, Tlaloc. And you, as the god king, would walk through this place regularly, inspecting your collection like a modern billionaire might inspect his classic car collection. Ah, yes, this jaguar is looking healthy. Make sure it gets extra heart meat from tomorrow's sacrifice. Those children look ready for the next rain ceremony. Have the priests examine them to ensure they'll cry properly when they're drowned. The albino woman in cage 7 seems depressed. Give her some chocolate and flowers. We want her happy when we sacrifice her to the moon goddess. The casual, bureaucratic horror of it all would be almost funny if it weren't so completely real. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the zoo wasn't what was kept there. It was how it was used as a tool of psychological warfare. When ambassadors from other cities visited Tenochtitlan, they were given tours of the zoo. They were shown the snakes being fed human hearts. They were introduced to the human specimens being prepared for sacrifice. They were allowed to hear the sounds that thousands of carnivorous animals make when they're well fed on human flesh. The message was clear. This is what happens to the enemies of the Aztec Empire. This is what we feed to our pets. And then these ambassadors would return to their own cities and report what they had seen, ensuring that the mere threat of Aztec displeasure would be enough to maintain order across the empire. Your zoo wasn't just a collection of animals. It was a weapon of mass psychological destruction. All right. Let's talk about something that the Spanish chroniclers found almost as disturbing as the human sacrifices: Aztec royal marriage customs. As the god king, your personal relationships aren't personal at all. They're affairs of state, religious obligations, and political necessities, all rolled into one supremely messed up package. First, let's talk numbers. You don't have a wife. You have wives. Plural, lots of them. Moctezuma, too, the last independent Aztec emperor, had over 100 wives. That's not a typo. 100 wives, ranging in age from preteen girls to elderly women in their 60s. But these weren't marriages in any sense that we would recognize. They were political alliances, religious obligations, and breeding programs, all at the same time. Some of your wives are daughters of allied rulers, married to you to cement military alliances. Some are daughters of conquered enemies, married to you to demonstrate their complete submission. Some are priestesses of various gods, married to you to maintain cosmic balance. And some are your own relatives. Yeah, we need to talk about that, because Aztec royal incest was systematic and religiously mandated. The Aztecs believed that divine blood needed to remain as pure as possible, which meant that the god king should primarily breed with his own sisters, daughters, and nieces. The closer the family relationship, the more divine the resulting children would be. Moctezuma II's primary wife, the one who would produce his heir, was his own sister. His secondary wives included several of his daughters and at least 3 of his nieces. From a modern perspective, this is obviously horrifying. But from an Aztec perspective, it was not only normal but necessary. Marrying outside the royal family would dilute the divine bloodline and potentially produce heirs who weren't capable of communicating with the gods. But here's what makes this even more disturbing. Many of these marriages were never consummated. Some of your wives are children, girls as young as 8 or 9 years old, married to you for political reasons but not expected to share your bed until they reach puberty. Others are elderly women, married to you to gain access to their family's wealth or political connections. And some are married to you specifically to be sacrificed. Yeah, that's a thing that happened. Certain religious ceremonies required the sacrifice of the god king's wife. Usually, these were elaborate affairs where the woman would be treated as a goddess for months before her death, given the finest clothes and foods, worshipped by the common people, and then ritually killed at the peak of a major festival. The woman chosen for this honor was usually selected from among your newer wives, someone whose family wouldn't cause too much political trouble when she died, but who was high-ranking enough that her sacrifice would be meaningful to the gods. Imagine the psychological impact of this system on everyone involved. Your wives never know if they're being married for politics, breeding, or eventual sacrifice. Your children grow up knowing that their father might marry them to himself, or that they might be selected for ritual death. And you have to maintain emotional distance from all of them, because getting too attached to someone who might need to be sacrificed for religious reasons would compromise your ability to rule effectively. The Spanish chroniclers described Moctezuma II as being completely emotionally detached from his family. He rarely spoke to his wives, except to give orders. He showed no favoritism toward his children. He could order the sacrifice of his own relatives without showing any emotion. This wasn't because he was naturally cold or cruel. It was because the alternative, allowing himself to love people who might need to die for the good of the empire, would have made it impossible for him to function as a god king. Now let's talk about what happens to your children, because this is where the cycle of systematic horror really becomes apparent. As the god king, you father dozens, possibly hundreds of children with your various wives. But these aren't just your offspring, they're potential future rulers of the empire. And that means their education is unlike anything that's ever existed anywhere else in the world. Aztec royal children are separated from their mothers at age 4 and placed in special schools called comicac, which we might generously translate as houses of learning, but which were really more like training camps for future religious psychopaths. Let me describe what your son's typical day looks like at the comicac. He wakes up at 4 a.m., for morning prayers and ritual bloodletting. That's right, 4-year-old children are taught to pierce their own earlobes with thorns and offer their blood to the gods. After bloodletting comes physical training. Not normal physical training like running and swimming, but combat training designed specifically for capturing prisoners alive. Your son learns to use obsidian-edged clubs, dart throwers, and shields. He practices fighting techniques whose goal is to disable rather than kill. Then comes religious education, which is where things get really disturbing. Your son doesn't just learn about the gods, he learns to participate in their worship. He watches human sacrifices from the time he can walk. He's taught to see the ritual murder of captives as beautiful, necessary, and holy. By age 8, he's assisting priests in minor ceremonies. By age 12, he's helping to hold down prisoners while their hearts are cut out. By age 16, he's performing sacrifices himself. All of this is considered normal, necessary education for future rulers, but academic subjects aren't neglected. Your son learns mathematics, astronomy, engineering, and history. He learns multiple languages. He studies the administrative systems that keep the empire running. The goal is to produce rulers who are simultaneously brilliant administrators and completely committed religious fanatics. And it works. The Spanish chroniclers consistently described Aztec nobles as being highly intelligent, well-educated, and absolutely ruthless in their religious duties. But there's a dark side to this educational system that goes beyond even the human sacrifice stuff. Not all of your children will survive to adulthood. Some will die in training accidents. Some will be selected for sacrifice to demonstrate your family's commitment to the gods. Some will be eliminated by rival relatives competing for succession. And some will be driven insane by the psychological pressure of trying to live up to divine expectations. Spanish chroniclers described meeting Aztec princes who had suffered complete mental breakdowns from the stress of their education. Young men who would spend hours staring at walls, muttering prayers. Others who would become convinced that they were personally responsible for every bad thing that happened in the empire. The most disturbing cases were the princes who had internalized the sacrificial religion so completely that they would volunteer themselves for ritual death, believing that their sacrifice would be more pleasing to the gods than the sacrifice of commoners. Imagine watching your own children slowly transformed from normal kids into religious fanatics willing to kill or die for cosmic abstractions. Imagine knowing that this transformation is necessary if they're going to be capable of ruling the empire after you're gone. Imagine having to maintain emotional distance from them because showing too much affection might make them soft, which would make them ineffective rulers, which would threaten the stability of the entire empire. This is the psychological burden that every Aztec god king carried. The knowledge that maintaining power required systematically destroying the humanity of everyone you loved. Let me tell you about something that would make a modern event planner quit their job and become a hermit. The Aztec religious calendar. See, as the god king, you don't just oversee occasional sacrifices when the mood strikes you or when you've captured some enemies. You're responsible for maintaining a complex schedule of religious festivals that runs throughout the entire year, each requiring specific types of human sacrifice performed in specific ways. The Aztec calendar wasn't just a way of keeping track of time, it was a detailed instruction manual for systematic ritual murder. Let me walk you through just a few months of your yearly schedule, and remember, as the God King, you have to personally oversee every single one of these festivals. We'll start with Atlcoalo, the first month of the Aztec year, dedicated to the rain god, Tlaloc. This festival requires the sacrifice of children, specifically children who cry easily, because their tears are believed to encourage rainfall. So your priests spend weeks before the festival identifying suitable children from across the empire. They look for kids with certain physical characteristics, usually those born with double cowlicks or other unusual features that mark them as chosen by Tenochtitlan. These children are then brought to Tenochtitlan and housed in special temples where they're pampered and treated like little gods for weeks before their death. They're given the finest clothes, the best food, and constant entertainment. The goal is to keep them happy right up until the moment of sacrifice, because children who die while crying produce more tears, which makes the rain god happier. On the day of the festival, these children, some as young as 6 years old, are taken to the top of the highest pyramid and slowly drowned in special pools, while priests collect their tears in sacred vessels. You, as the God King, have to watch this entire process and show appropriate reverence for the religious significance of drowning children to make it rain. But wait, there's more. The next month is Tlaxcipizli, dedicated to the flayed god Zyptotec. This festival requires prisoners to be skinned alive, and then priests wear their skins for 20 days while performing ritual dances. But it's not just simple flaying. There are elaborate preliminary tortures. Prisoners are tied to posts and shot with arrows, but carefully so they don't die quickly. The goal is to make them bleed as much as possible before the final skinning, because Zyptotec is nourished by both blood and skin. After the skinning, the priests put on the fresh human hide-like clothing and dance through the streets of Tenochtitlan while the skin slowly rots on their bodies. By the end of the 20 days, they're dancing around in putrefying human flesh that's literally falling off them in chunks. And you have to act like this is beautiful and holy. Then comes Toza Stuntly, which focuses on child sacrifice again. But this time, the children are flayed after being killed, and their skins are worn by young priests who perform agricultural rituals to ensure good crops. Are you starting to see the pattern here? Every single month has its own special type of horrific ritual murder. And as the God King, you're not just a spectator, you're the host of the world's most disturbing dinner party. But here's what makes this even more psychologically devastating. You can never take a break from it. Modern people can compartmentalize violence. A soldier can go to war and then come home and try to live a normal life. A surgeon can perform operations and then go home and forget about blood for a while. You don't get that luxury. Every single day of your life is scheduled around some form of ritual killing. If it's not a major festival requiring hundreds of sacrifices, it's a minor ceremony requiring a few. If it's not a ceremony, it's preparation for the next ceremony. The Spanish chronicler Diego Duran calculated that the Aztec religious calendar included 18 major festivals per year, each lasting multiple days, plus numerous minor festivals and daily ritual obligations. That means you're overseeing ritual human sacrifice approximately 150 days per year. That's more than 40% of your entire life spent watching people being tortured to death for religious reasons. And remember, these aren't anonymous victims. Many of these people are brought to you personally before their sacrifice. You're expected to speak with them, to evaluate their worthiness as offerings to the gods. Some are enemy nobles who you've known for years through diplomatic contacts. Some are your own subjects who have volunteered for sacrifice as a religious honor. You have to look them in the eyes, knowing they're going to die horribly in a few hours, and act like this is the most natural thing in the world. The psychological toll of this system would break most modern people within weeks. But you don't just have to endure it, you have to appear enthusiastic about it. Because any sign that you're not completely committed to the religious traditions would undermine your divine authority. Now let's talk about something that the Spanish chroniclers found almost more disturbing than the scale of Aztec human sacrifice: the sophistication of it. See, this wasn't random violence or crude butchery. The Aztecs had developed human sacrifice into what can only be described as a highly advanced science, with specialized techniques developed for different gods, different purposes, and different desired outcomes. They had priests who spent their entire lives studying the most effective methods of ritual killing. They had craftsmen who specialized in making sacrificial tools. They had architects who designed temples specifically to optimize the acoustics and visibility of sacrificial ceremonies. Let me describe some of the more advanced techniques, because understanding the level of systematic sophistication involved helps explain why this system was so effective at maintaining social control. For sacrifices to Huitzilopochtli, the war god, the method was the classic heart extraction that everyone knows about. But it wasn't as simple as just cutting someone open and pulling out their heart. The priests who performed these sacrifices trained for years to perfect their technique. They could remove a heart in less than 30 seconds, while keeping the victim conscious and the heart beating for as long as possible. They knew exactly where to cut to avoid damaging the heart itself, because a damaged heart was considered an imperfect offering. The obsidian knives used for these sacrifices were sharper than modern surgical steel. They could cut through flesh and bone with minimal pressure, which meant the priests could work quickly and precisely. But different gods required different methods, and the Aztecs had developed specialized techniques for each one. Sacrifices to Tlaloc, the rain god, required the victims to cry as much as possible before death. So the priests developed methods of torture specifically designed to produce tears without causing unconsciousness. They would remove small pieces of skin, break individual fingers and toes, and use salt to intensify pain from wounds. Sacrifices to Xipe required perfect skinning, so the priests developed flaying techniques that could remove human skin in single pieces without damaging it. The Spanish chroniclers described seeing human skins that had been removed so skillfully they looked like complete leather suits. For sacrifices to Mictlantecutli, the death god, victims were required to die slowly over a period of days. The priests developed methods of systematic torture that could keep people alive and conscious while gradually destroying their bodies. They could break bones without causing fatal internal bleeding. They could remove skin and flesh without causing death from shock. They could cause excruciating pain while maintaining the victim's consciousness right up to the moment of death. And all of this was considered religious art. The Spanish chroniclers consistently described these priests as being highly intelligent, well-educated men who could discuss philosophy, mathematics, and astronomy with European scholars. They weren't sadistic psychopaths, they were brilliant academics who had dedicated their lives to perfecting the science of ritual murder. But here's what makes this truly disturbing. The sophistication of these techniques meant that the sacrifices were more effective as tools of social control. When you can kill someone slowly, precisely, and publicly, in ways that demonstrate complete mastery over human life and death, you're sending a much more powerful message than if you just execute them quickly. When foreign ambassadors visited Tenochtitlan and saw prisoners being systematically tortured to death by men who could explain the religious and philosophical significance of each cut, each broken bone, each extracted organ, they weren't just seeing violence, they were seeing the complete intellectual and spiritual commitment of an entire civilization to the practice of ritual murder. The message was clear. These people haven't just chosen to be cruel, they've turned cruelty into a high art form, backed by centuries of religious tradition and scientific study. Fighting against the Aztec Empire meant fighting against people who had spent generations perfecting the most sophisticated torture methods in human history, and who genuinely believed that using these methods was their divine duty. Let's talk about your office, because as disturbing as the human sacrifices were, the places where they happened were designed to be even more psychologically devastating. Aztec religious architecture wasn't just about creating impressive buildings. It was about creating spaces that would amplify the psychological impact of ritual murder to the maximum possible degree. Take the Great Temple of Tenochtitlan, where you spend most of your time overseeing sacrifices. This isn't just a pyramid, it's a carefully designed psychological weapon. The temple rises over 200 feet above the city, making it visible from anywhere in the valley. When sacrifices are being performed at the top, the entire population can see them happening. There's no way to avoid being aware of what's going on. But the real genius is in the acoustics. The Aztec architects designed the temple so that the sounds of the sacrifices, the chanting of the priests, the screams of the victims, the cheering of the crowds, would carry across the entire city. Modern acoustic engineers have confirmed that you could hear a human sacrifice happening on the Great Temple from over a mile away. Imagine living in a city where you can hear people being tortured to death from your bedroom window several times a week. But it gets worse. The sides of the pyramid are designed as amplify and distort sound. The Spanish chroniclers described hearing inhuman howling coming from the temple, sounds that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Modern acoustic analysis suggests that the temple was designed to create what psychologists call phantom sounds, auditory illusions that make people think they're hearing things that aren't really there. So not only could you hear the actual sounds of human sacrifice echoing across the city, but the architecture itself was creating additional terrifying sounds that seemed to come from the spirit world. The visual design was equally sophisticated. The temple was painted in bright colors that would be visible for miles, and the walls were covered in carvings depicting the gods consuming human hearts and blood. But the most disturbing architectural feature was the skull racks, called tezonpantli, that surrounded the base of the temple. These weren't just random piles of bones. They were carefully organized displays containing thousands upon thousands of human skulls, arranged in geometric patterns that created a kind of macabre art installation. The Spanish conquistador Ander Erster Tapia counted the skulls in just one section of the Tezonpantli and estimated that the complete display contained over 136,000 human skulls. Let that number sink in for a moment. 136,000 human skulls arranged in artistic patterns around the base of your primary workplace. And these skulls weren't ancient relics. They were constantly being refreshed with new ones as the old ones decayed. Imagine walking to work every day past displays containing more human remains than most modern cities have total population. But the architects weren't done yet. The interior spaces of the temple were designed to be equally psychologically disturbing. The sacrificial chambers were small, cramped spaces with low ceilings that would make anyone feel claustrophobic. The walls were stained dark with centuries of blood, and the smell of death was literally built into the architecture. The Spanish chroniclers described chambers where the smell was so overwhelming that even hardened soldiers would vomit immediately upon entering. But perhaps the most disturbing architectural feature was the underground chambers beneath the temple, where the Aztecs stored ritual implements and prepared victims for sacrifice. These underground spaces were designed as sensory deprivation chambers. No windows, no natural light, minimal sound from the outside world. Prisoners could be kept in these spaces for weeks before their sacrifice, gradually losing their sense of time and reality. The psychological effect was to break down the victim's resistance before they were brought up to the altar, making them more compliant during the actual sacrifice ceremony. And you, as the God King, had your own private chambers within this complex. Rooms where you could observe all of this happening while remaining hidden from the crowds. Your bedroom was literally inside a building designed to optimize the psychological impact of mass murder. Now let's talk about one of the most surreal aspects of your daily life as an Aztec God King, conducting normal diplomatic relations with foreign powers while simultaneously running the most elaborate ritual murder operation in human history. See, the Aztec Empire wasn't isolated. You had regular contact with dozens of other kingdoms, city-states, and empires throughout Mesoamerica. You had to negotiate trade agreements, military alliances, and territorial disputes just like any other ruler. But you had to do all of this while making it clear that your empire was built on systematic human sacrifice, and that anyone who crossed you would end up on the altar. This created some of the most bizarre diplomatic situations in recorded history. Let me give you an example. You're negotiating a trade agreement with representatives from Mayopan, a Maya city-state several hundred miles away. These are sophisticated people. They have their own writing system, their own calendar, their own advanced architecture and astronomy. They're sitting in your throne room, which is decorated with human skulls and murals depicting ritual sacrifices. They can smell the blood from the morning's sacrifices drifting in through the windows. They can hear the screams of prisoners being tortured in the dungeons beneath the palace. And you're all discussing the price of cacao beans and jade jewelry like this is the most normal business meeting in the world. But here's where it gets really weird. Many of these foreign diplomats are genuinely impressed by your sacrifice system. To understand why, you have to remember that human sacrifice wasn't unique to the Aztecs. Most Mesoamerican civilizations practiced it to some degree. What made the Aztecs unique was the scale and sophistication of their sacrificial religion. So when foreign ambassadors visited Tenochtitlan and saw your operation, they weren't horrified. They were awed. They were seeing what human sacrifice could become when it was organized by a truly advanced civilization. The Maya ambassadors might go home and report, "The Aztecs are sacrificing 500 people per month with a level of religious precision that makes our own ceremonies look primitive. Their priests have developed techniques we've never imagined. Their gods must be very pleased with them." This meant that your reputation for religious sophistication actually enhanced your diplomatic position. Other rulers wanted to ally with you, not despite your human sacrifice practices, but because of them. But this created its own set of problems, because you had to constantly prove that your sacrificial religion was more advanced than everyone else's. If the Maya were sacrificing 100 people at their spring festival, you had to sacrifice 500. If the Zapotecs had developed a new method of ritual torture, you had to develop 3 new methods. It was like an arms race, but instead of nuclear weapons, you were competing to see who could kill people in the most religiously sophisticated ways. And you couldn't just talk about it, you had to demonstrate it. When important foreign dignitaries visited your capital, part of the standard diplomatic protocol was giving them tours of your sacrifice facilities. They would be shown the various temples, the different types of altars, the specialized tools used for different ceremonies. They would be invited to witness actual sacrifices, and their reactions would be carefully observed by your intelligence officials. A diplomat who seemed insufficiently impressed by your sacrifice techniques might be representing a kingdom that was planning to challenge Aztec supremacy. But a diplomat who was too impressed might be gathering intelligence for a future attack. So you had to maintain this delicate balance where you demonstrated enough sophistication to intimidate potential enemies, but not so much that you gave away military secrets. And all of this had to be done while maintaining the fiction that you were conducting normal diplomatic relations between civilized nations. The Spanish chroniclers described diplomatic banquets where Aztec and foreign officials would discuss trade routes and territorial boundaries while being served meals that included human flesh, with everyone pretending that this was completely normal. They described treaty negotiations where the terms included specific provisions for how many prisoners each side would provide for the other's sacrificial ceremonies. They described military alliances where the primary benefit wasn't mutual defense, but mutual cooperation in capturing sacrificial victims from third parties. From a modern perspective, it's like reading about trade negotiations between different organized crime families, except that everyone involved genuinely believed they were performing essential religious duties. Let's take a step back from all the blood and horror for a moment and talk about something that might be even more psychologically devastating: the complete impossibility of ever being yourself. As an Aztec god king, you don't just have royal duties, you have divine duties. And that means that every single moment of your life is a performance for an audience that includes not just your subjects, but the gods themselves. You can never relax. You can never let your guard down. You can never express doubt, fear, sadness, or any other emotion that might suggest you're not in complete control of both the earthly and spiritual realms. Let me give you an example of what this means in practice. Your son, let's say he's 8 years old, falls seriously ill. He's running a high fever, he's delirious, and your physicians are telling you privately that he might die. As a normal parent, you would be terrified. You would want to stay by his bedside, hold his hand, comfort him, maybe even cry from worry and grief. But you're not a normal parent. You're a god king. If you show too much concern for your son's illness, it suggests that you don't have confidence in your ability to intercede with the gods on his behalf. If you appear worried, it implies that your divine power might not be sufficient to protect your own family. So instead of acting like a concerned father, you have to act like a confident God who is merely observing the working out of cosmic forces that you have under control. You visit your son's bedside, but only briefly, and only with the appropriate retinue of priests and nobles. You perform the proper rituals and make the proper offerings. You speak the correct prayers in the correct ceremonial language, and then you leave, even though every parental instinct is screaming at you to stay. If your son dies, you have to oversee his funeral ceremony with the same divine composure you show for everything else. You can't grieve publicly, because gods don't grieve. They simply accept the cosmic necessity of death. If your son recovers, you have to act as though his recovery was the natural result of your divine intervention, not a source of relief and joy. Either way, you can never, ever, just be a father worried about his sick child. Now multiply this emotional suppression across every aspect of your life: your wives, your other children, your friends, your own health, your own fears about death or failure. None of it can be acknowledged or expressed in any human way. You are required to be a living symbol of divine perfection 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, for your entire life. And here's what makes this even more psychologically devastating. You know it's a performance, but you can never admit that you know it's a performance. Deep down, you're still human. You still feel fear when enemy armies approach your borders. You still feel grief when people you care about die. You still feel doubt about whether all these sacrifices are really necessary. But acknowledging those feelings, even to yourself, would mean acknowledging that you're not actually divine, which would make you a fraud ruling through false pretenses. So you have to suppress not just the expression of human emotions, but the emotions themselves. You have to convince yourself that your divine persona is your real self, and that any human feelings you might have are weaknesses to be overcome. The Spanish chroniclers consistently described Aztec rulers as being emotionally distant to the point of seeming almost inhuman. They rarely smiled. They never showed anger or frustration. They spoke in formal ritual language, even in casual conversations. But this wasn't because they were naturally cold people. It was because they had spent their entire lives training themselves to suppress every trace of ordinary human emotion. And the tragic irony is that this emotional suppression, which was meant to make them more effective rulers, probably made them less effective in many ways. A ruler who can't acknowledge his own doubts can't learn from his mistakes. A ruler who can't express genuine emotion can't form the personal relationships that are essential for effective leadership. A ruler who has to pretend to be divine can't adapt to changing circumstances that his divine persona wouldn't be able to handle. So you're trapped in this cycle where maintaining your divine authority requires you to suppress the very human qualities that would make you a better ruler, which gradually makes you a worse ruler, which requires you to rely more heavily on your divine authority, which requires even more emotional suppression. It's a psychological death spiral disguised as religious devotion. Let's talk about something that doesn't get enough attention in most discussions of Aztec civilization: the sheer economic cost of running an empire based on systematic human sacrifice. Because all of this horror we've been describing, it was incredibly expensive. Think about it from a purely logistical perspective. You're running a civilization that requires the ritual murder of thousands of people per month, every month, year after year. The economic infrastructure required to support this system was massive and complex. First, there's the cost of capturing all these prisoners. Every sacrificial victim represents a significant military investment. You need armies to capture them, supply lines to support those armies, weapons and equipment for the soldiers, food and water for campaigns that might last months. The Spanish estimated that the Aztec military consisted of over 200,000 active soldiers, plus support personnel. That's a standing army larger than most modern countries maintain. And its primary purpose wasn't territorial defense or expansion. It was prisoner capture for religious ceremonies. Then there's the cost of transporting and housing all these prisoners. You need specialized facilities to hold thousands of people who are waiting to be sacrificed. You need guards to prevent escapes. You need food and water to keep them alive and healthy until their scheduled deaths. You need medical personnel to treat injuries sustained during capture, because damaged goods aren't acceptable offerings to the gods. You need administrators to organize and schedule the various ceremonies. You need craftsmen to manufacture the specialized tools and ceremonial objects required for different types of sacrifice. And then there's the cost of the priesthood itself. The Aztec Empire employed thousands of full-time priests whose only job was organizing and performing human sacrifices. These weren't part-time religious officials who also worked as farmers or craftsmen. They were professional ritual murderers who had to be fed, clothed, and housed by the state. The Spanish chroniclers estimated that the Great Temple of Tenochtitlan alone employed over 5,000 priests, plus support staff. And that was just one temple in one city. The empire had hundreds of temples, each with its own priestly hierarchy. These priests weren't cheap to maintain. They required special diets, ceremonial clothing, religious implements, and living quarters within the temple complexes. Many of them were highly educated men who could have been valuable administrators, engineers, or scholars if they hadn't been dedicated to ritual murder instead. But perhaps the biggest economic cost was the opportunity cost of all those sacrificial victims. Every person sacrificed to the gods was someone who could have been a farmer, craftsman, soldier, administrator, or taxpayer. The Aztecs were literally killing their potential workforce for religious reasons. Conservative estimates suggest that the Aztec Empire sacrificed at least 20,000 people per year. That's 20,000 people who could have been producing goods, paying taxes, having children who would grow up to be productive citizens, and contributing to the economic growth of the empire. Instead, they were being killed to satisfy religious obligations that produced no tangible economic benefit whatsoever. And this number is probably far too low. Some scholars estimate that the actual number of annual sacrifices was closer to 250,000 people per year. To put that in perspective, the entire population of the Aztec Empire was probably around 15 million people. So they were killing between 0.1% and 1.7% of their total population every single year for purely religious reasons. Imagine if the United States decided to ritually murder between 300,000 and 5 million people annually to appease various gods. The economic impact would be catastrophic. But somehow, the Aztec Empire not only survived this massive economic drain, it thrived. Tenochtitlan became one of the largest cities in the world. Aztec art, architecture, and engineering rivaled anything being produced in Europe at the same time. How was this possible? The answer lies in the tribute system we discussed earlier. The Aztecs were so effective at extracting wealth from their subject cities that they could afford to waste enormous amounts of resources on ritual murder and still maintain one of the most sophisticated civilizations in the world. Essentially, they solved the economic problem of human sacrifice by making other people pay for it. Every city that submitted to Aztec rule had to provide not just material tribute, but also the prisoners who would be sacrificed in religious ceremonies. So the economic cost of maintaining the sacrificial system was distributed across the entire empire, while the political and religious benefits accrued primarily to the ruling class in Tenochtitlan. It was a form of religious taxation, where the tax was paid in human lives instead of gold or goods. But this system created its own economic distortions. Subject cities had to divert resources from productive activities to prisoner capture. They had to maintain military forces capable of raiding their neighbors for sacrificial victims. They had to develop administrative systems for selecting and transporting prisoners to Tenochtitlan. In effect, the entire Mesoamerican economy was being warped by the religious requirements of a single city. And you, as the God King, were at the center of this massive, continent-spanning system of ritualized economic destruction. Every morning when you woke up and performed your bloodletting rituals, you were participating in an economic system that was consuming human lives and material resources on a scale that would make modern military-industrial complexes look efficient by comparison. And then, one day in 1519, everything changed for your Moctezuma too. You're sitting on your golden throne in your palace that's larger than any European castle, ruling over an empire that stretches from coast to coast, and your scouts bring you the most bizarre news you've ever heard. Strange men with pale skin and hair covering their faces have arrived on the eastern coast. They ride on giant animals that no one has ever seen before. They carry weapons that produce thunder and lightning. Their boats are like floating temples made of materials that don't exist in your world. And according to your religious calendar, this is exactly when the god Quetzalcoatl is supposed to return from the east. Now, from our modern perspective, it's easy to see what was really happening. Spanish conquistadors, led by Hernan Cortes, had arrived with horses, steel weapons, gunpowder, and sailing ships, technology that was completely unknown in the Americas. But put yourself in Moctezuma's position. You've spent your entire life in a world where the distinction between the natural and supernatural doesn't exist. Everything that happens is the result of divine intervention. Your entire worldview is built around the idea that gods regularly intervene in human affairs. So when men arrive who possess seemingly magical powers, riding creatures from legend, wielding weapons that control the forces of nature itself, the logical conclusion is that they must be gods. And if they're gods, then treating them as anything less than divine would be not just politically dangerous, but cosmically catastrophic. So you do what any rational Aztec ruler would do. You send them gifts worthy of gods and invite them to your capital as honored guests. The gifts you send are incredible by any standard. Gold ornaments weighing hundreds of pounds, feathered cloaks that took years to make, jade jewelry worth more than most European kingdoms' annual budgets. You're basically sending them the crown jewels of an entire civilization. And their response? They melt down the gold ornaments to make ingots, throw away the feathered artwork, and ask if you have any more gold. This should have been your first hint that these might not be the sophisticated gods you were expecting. But by then, it's too late. You've already established the precedent that these strangers are divine beings who deserve special treatment. Changing your position now would mean admitting that your divine wisdom was wrong, which would undermine your authority with your own people. So you're trapped in this impossible situation where you have to continue treating the Spanish as gods even as they demonstrate, day after day, that they're just men who are interested in gold, not religious devotion, men who are disgusted by your sacrificial ceremonies, men who worship a completely different god who apparently demands that you stop all the rituals that maintain cosmic balance. And meanwhile, your own people are starting to wonder why these gods seem so unimpressed by the religious traditions that have maintained the empire for centuries. The Spanish chroniclers describe Moctezuma during this period as seeming confused and indecisive in a way that was completely unlike his usual divine composure. For the first time in his life, he was facing a situation that his religious training hadn't prepared him for. How do you maintain your status as a god king when other gods show up and make it clear that they don't recognize your authority? How do you continue performing human sacrifices when the gods themselves are telling you to stop? How do you rule an empire that's based on religious certainty, when the fundamental assumptions of your religion are being challenged by divine beings who seem to have different rules? But perhaps the most psychologically devastating part of the Spanish arrival was what it revealed about the true nature of the Aztec Empire. See, the Spanish weren't impressed by Tenochtitlan's size or sophistication. They weren't awed by the complex religious ceremonies. They weren't intimidated by the skull racks or the human sacrifice rituals. They were horrified. For the first time in his life, Moctezuma was seeing his civilization through the eyes of outsiders who didn't share his religious assumptions. And from that perspective, the empire he had devoted his life to maintaining didn't look like a sophisticated religious system. It looked like a charnel house run by The Spanish described the Aztec capital as a place where the devil himself might dwell, where the streets ran with human blood and the air was thick with the smoke of burning hearts. They described the Aztec nobility as intelligent but completely corrupted by their participation in ritual murder, capable of discussing philosophy and mathematics while casually ordering the torture and death of hundreds of people. They described the Aztec religious system as an elaborate form of devil worship that had deceived an entire civilization into believing that systematic murder was a form of divine service. And the worst part was, once you started seeing your empire through Spanish eyes, it became impossible to unsee it. The magnificent temples started to look like slaughterhouses. The elaborate ceremonies started to seem like organized insanity. The divine authority that had justified your entire existence started to seem like a massive, centuries-long delusion. But you couldn't act on these doubts, because admitting that the Spanish might be right about your religion would mean admitting that you had spent your entire life participating in monstrous acts for no good reason. So you were trapped between two impossible alternatives. Continue defending a religious system that was starting to seem obviously wrong, or admit that your entire civilization was built on a foundation of systematic horror. The final months of Moctezuma II's reign represent one of the most psychologically complex periods in recorded history. He is a man who has spent his entire life as the absolute ruler of 15 million people, convinced of his own divinity, confident in his religious traditions, and suddenly, everything he believes about the nature of reality is being challenged by forces he can't understand or control. Let me paint you a picture of what those final months were like from Moctezuma's perspective. The Spanish are living in your palace as honored guests, but they're clearly not content with the role of visiting gods. They're asking probing questions about your military forces, your tribute system, your religious ceremonies. They're mapping your city, studying your defenses, and making contact with your enemies. And they're making it increasingly clear that they find your religious practices abhorrent. Courts and his men refuse to participate in any ceremonies involving human sacrifice. They refuse to eat food that might contain human flesh. They refuse to enter the temples where the sacrificial altars are located. Instead, they keep talking about their own god, a god who supposedly demands that you stop all human sacrifice immediately and convert your entire empire to a completely different religion. From your perspective, this is like being told that everything you've believed about the fundamental nature of reality is wrong, and that the religious practices that have maintained cosmic balance for centuries are actually evil. But you can't just ignore these demands, because the Spanish have demonstrated that they possess supernatural powers. Their weapons can kill at a distance. Their animals can move faster than any human. Their ships can travel across vast oceans. If they're not gods, they're at least the representatives of gods, who are more powerful than the ones you've been serving. So you're faced with an impossible choice. Continue following the religious traditions that have defined your entire civilization, or abandon those traditions in favor of a completely foreign religion that demands you stop all the practices that maintain your divine authority. Either choice leads to the destruction of everything you've spent your life building. If you continue the human sacrifices, you risk angering the Spanish and their god, who have already demonstrated their ability to destroy armies and cities. If you stop the human sacrifices, you undermine the entire religious foundation of your empire and risk losing the loyalty of your priests, your nobles, and your people. Meanwhile, your subject cities are starting to rebel, seeing the arrival of the Spanish as an opportunity to throw off Aztec rule. Your own nobles are beginning to question your leadership, wondering why their god-kings seem so unable to deal with these foreign visitors. And your priests are becoming increasingly agitated, insisting that the cosmic balance is being disrupted by your failure to maintain proper sacrificial schedules. The psychological pressure of trying to navigate this impossible situation would break most people completely, and there's evidence that it did break Moctezuma. Spanish chroniclers describe him as becoming increasingly erratic and withdrawn during his final months. He would spend hours staring at the walls of his chambers, apparently lost in thought. He would issue contradictory orders, demanding human sacrifices one day and forbidding them the next. He began to question his own priests about the theological implications of the Spanish arrival. If Quetzalcoatl had really returned, what did that mean for the worship of of Huitzilopochtli. If the Spanish god was more powerful than the Aztec gods, should the empire convert to Christianity? These weren't just political questions, they were existential crises for someone whose entire identity was built around his role as a divine intermediary. And, perhaps most disturbingly, he began to question whether the human sacrifices had ever been necessary at all. Think about what this means for someone who has personally overseen the ritual murder of thousands of people. If the Spanish are right, if human sacrifice is not just unnecessary but evil, then Moctezuma has spent his entire adult life committing monstrous acts for no reason. Every child he watched being drowned to make it rain. Every warrior he watched being flayed alive to honor the gods. Every prisoner whose heart he watched being cut out while they were still conscious. All of it would have been meaningless cruelty disguised as religious duty. The psychological weight of this possibility would be enough to drive anyone insane. And that may be exactly what happened. The end came on June 29th, 1520, and even today, historians aren't entirely sure what actually happened. The official Spanish version is that Moctezuma was killed by stones thrown by his own people during a riot. According to courts, he had brought Moctezuma out onto a balcony to try to calm the crowds that were attacking the Spanish garrison, and the angry Aztecs pelted their own emperor with rocks until he died from his injuries. But many historians doubt this story, and there's significant evidence that Moctezuma was actually murdered by the Spanish themselves. From our perspective, the exact cause of his death matters less than what his death represents. The end of a worldview that had sustained one of the greatest civilizations in human history. But let's think about what those final moments might have been like from Moctezuma's perspective, because they encapsulate the psychological horror that defined the entire experience of being an Aztec god-king. Whether he was killed by his own people or by the Spanish, Moctezuma died knowing that his divine authority had completely collapsed. The religious system that had justified his entire existence had been revealed to be powerless against foreign gods and foreign weapons. The empire he had spent his life maintaining was disintegrating around him. Cities that had paid tribute for generations were declaring independence. Nobles who had once crawled on their bellies in his presence were openly questioning his decisions. Priests who had once treated him as a living god were beginning to wonder if he had lost his divine connection. But perhaps most devastatingly, he died knowing that all of those human sacrifices, all of that systematic, religiously justified murder, had accomplished nothing. The gods he had spent his life serving either didn't exist or were powerless against the Christian god of the Spanish. The cosmic balance he had tried to maintain through ritual bloodshed was apparently irrelevant to the actual forces that governed the universe. Thousands of people had died horrible deaths on his orders, and it had all been for nothing. If there's a more complete psychological collapse imaginable, I can't think of what it would be. So what can we learn from this absolutely horrifying deep dive into the life of Aztec god-kings? First, I think it's important to understand that these weren't monsters. The Spanish chroniclers, despite their obvious biases and their horror at Aztec religious practices, consistently described individual Aztec rulers as intelligent, sophisticated, and even admirable in many ways. Moctezuma, too, was fluent in multiple languages, well-versed in mathematics and astronomy, and capable of managing one of the most complex administrative systems in the world. He was also, by the standards of his time and culture, a deeply religious man who genuinely believed he was serving the gods and maintaining cosmic balance. The horror of the Aztec system wasn't that it was run by evil people, it was that it was run by good people, who had been convinced that systematic murder was a religious duty. And that's what makes this story so disturbing, and so relevant to our modern world, because the psychological mechanisms that allowed the Aztecs to commit atrocities while maintaining their sense of moral righteousness are the same mechanisms that have allowed humans to commit atrocities throughout history. The belief that your group has special knowledge about the nature of reality, the conviction that your cause is so important that any means are justified in pursuing it, the ability to dehumanize victims by casting them as enemies of cosmic order rather than as individual human beings, the systematic suppression of doubt and empathy in favor of ideological certainty. These aren't specifically Aztec traits. They're human traits that can emerge in any society under the right conditions. The Aztecs just took them further than almost anyone else in history. But there's another lesson here that might be even more important. The danger of allowing religious or ideological systems to become so complex and sophisticated that questioning them becomes almost impossible. The Aztec sacrificial religion wasn't a crude superstition. It was an incredibly elaborate intellectual system that could account for almost any objection or contradiction. There were theological explanations for why the gods sometimes seemed to ignore sacrifices. There were philosophical justifications for why some people deserved to die for the good of the cosmos. There were scientific methodologies for determining the most effective sacrificial techniques. The sheer intellectual sophistication of the system made it almost impossible for people within it to recognize its fundamental wrongness. And this is a pattern we see throughout history. The more elaborate and intellectually sophisticated a harmful ideology becomes, the harder it is for people within that ideology to recognize its harmfulness. The Nazis had elaborate racial theories backed by pseudo-scientific research. The Soviets had detailed economic theories that justified any amount of suffering in pursuit of the perfect society. The Aztecs had complex religious theories that justified any amount of murder in pursuit of cosmic balance. In each case, the intellectual sophistication of the system served to obscure its moral bankruptcy. Now, before anyone gets uncomfortable, I'm not suggesting that modern societies are directly comparable to the Aztec Empire. We don't practice human sacrifice, and our political and religious systems are very different from those of 16th century Mesoamerica. But there are some disturbing parallels that are worth thinking about. Consider how many modern atrocities have been justified by appeals to higher purposes that supposedly transcend individual human welfare. How many people have died in the name of national security, ideological purity, economic efficiency, or social progress? Consider how often societies have developed elaborate intellectual justifications for treating certain groups of people as less than fully human, and therefore acceptable to sacrifice for the greater good. Consider how rarely people in positions of power are willing to question systems that benefit them, even when those systems cause enormous suffering to others. And consider how often societies have convinced themselves that their particular form of violence is uniquely justified, uniquely necessary, and uniquely moral, while being horrified by the violence practiced by other societies. The Aztecs genuinely believed that their human sacrifices were necessary to maintain cosmic balance. They were convinced that without these rituals, the sun would stop rising and the world would end. What do we genuinely believe is necessary to maintain our way of life? What violence do we accept as inevitable, unavoidable, or justified by higher purposes? I'm not suggesting that there are easy answers to these questions, or that all forms of violence are morally equivalent, but I think there's value in using the extreme case of the Aztecs to examine our own assumptions about when violence is justified, and who gets to make those decisions. Because if there's one thing that the story of the Aztec god kings teaches us, It's that human beings have an almost infinite capacity for convincing themselves that horrible things are actually good things, as long as those horrible things serve the interests of the groups they identify with. The Aztec priests, who spent their lives perfecting techniques for ritual torture, weren't sadists. They were deeply religious men who believed they were serving the highest possible purpose. The Aztec nobles who attended human sacrifice ceremonies weren't psychopaths. They were sophisticated people who saw these rituals as beautiful expressions of cosmic truth. The Aztec god kings, who ordered the deaths of thousands, weren't tyrants. They were rulers who genuinely believed they were maintaining the stability of the universe itself. And yet all of that sincere belief, all of that intellectual sophistication, all of that religious devotion, led to one of the most systematically horrible civilizations in human history, which suggests that sincerity, sophistication, and devotion aren't enough to prevent moral catastrophe. In fact, they might sometimes make moral catastrophe more likely, because they make it easier for people to convince themselves that their harmful actions are actually virtuous. So as we wrap up this journey into one of history's darkest chapters, I want to leave you with some questions that I think are worth pondering. First, what beliefs do you hold so strongly that you never seriously question them? What assumptions about the world are so fundamental to your identity that examining them feels dangerous or impossible? The Aztecs never seriously questioned whether human sacrifice was necessary, because questioning it would have undermined the entire foundation of their civilization. What foundations of our civilization do we never seriously question? Second, what violence do you accept as normal, necessary, or justified? What suffering do you ignore because acknowledging it would be inconvenient or would require you to change your lifestyle? The Aztecs accepted the systematic murder of thousands of people because they believed it was necessary for their society to function. What do we accept because we believe it's necessary for our society to function? Third, how often do you examine your beliefs and practices from the perspective of outsiders who don't share your assumptions? How often do you seriously consider the possibility that things you consider normal might seem horrifying to people from different cultures or future generations? The Aztecs couldn't see the horror of their practices because they were too deeply embedded in their own cultural assumptions. What practices of our own culture might seem horrifying to outsiders or to future generations? Fourth, when you encounter people or societies whose practices seem obviously wrong to you, how often do you try to understand how those practices might seem reasonable from the perspective of the people involved? It's easy to look at the Aztecs and dismiss them as primitive savages who were obviously evil. It's much harder to recognize that they were intelligent, sophisticated people who had convinced themselves that their horrible practices were morally necessary. And if we can't understand how intelligent, sophisticated people can convince themselves that horrible things are good, then we have no protection against convincing ourselves that our own horrible things are good. Fifth, what would it take for you to change your mind about something fundamental? What kind of evidence would be sufficient to convince you that a belief you hold strongly is actually wrong? Moctezuma too was presented with overwhelming evidence that his religious beliefs might be wrong. But he was psychologically unable to accept that evidence, because doing so would have required him to acknowledge that he had spent his life committing atrocities for no reason. What beliefs do you hold that you would be psychologically unable to abandon, regardless of the evidence against them? I know this has been a difficult journey, spending several hours thinking about systematic torture, ritual murder, and the psychological mechanisms that allow ordinary people to participate in atrocities isn't exactly pleasant. But I think there's value in confronting these dark aspects of human nature, because the alternative, pretending they don't exist, or that they only exist in other people, makes us more vulnerable to them. The Aztecs weren't uniquely evil. They were humans who had created a system that channeled normal human psychology in destructive directions. And because they were humans like us, we have the capacity to create similar systems if we're not careful. But we also have something the Aztecs didn't have: historical perspective. We can look back at their civilization and see clearly what they couldn't see about themselves. We can recognize the warning signs, the psychological patterns, the social mechanisms that led to their particular form of moral catastrophe. And, if we're honest with ourselves, we can use that perspective to examine our own civilization more critically. We can ask uncomfortable questions about our own practices, our own assumptions, our own blind spots. We can look for the places where we might be convincing ourselves that harmful things are actually good things. We can try to develop the intellectual humility to recognize that we, like every human society before us, are probably wrong about some things that seem obviously true to us. And we can cultivate the moral courage to change course when we discover that we've been wrong. This isn't easy. It requires us to hold two difficult truths in tension: that moral progress is possible, but that we ourselves might be obstacles to that progress. It requires us to believe that we can build better societies while also recognizing that every society in history has believed it was building something better than what came before. It requires us to have enough confidence in our values to act on them, while also having enough humility to question them. But I think this kind of difficult self-examination is exactly what the story of the Aztec god kings demands from us. Because if we can't learn from their mistakes, we're doomed to repeat them in new forms. And if we can't see the humanity in people who committed monstrous acts while believing they were doing good, then we have no hope of recognizing the potential for monstrosity in ourselves. The Aztec Empire officially ended on August 13th, 1521, when the last emperor, Cuauhtémoc, surrendered to Spanish forces after a siege that lasted 93 days and killed most of the population of Tenochtitlan. The great city that had once been home to 200,000 people was reduced to rubble. The temples where thousands had been sacrificed were torn down and replaced with Christian churches. The complex system of tribute and human sacrifice that had sustained the empire for over a century was abolished and replaced with Spanish colonial administration. Within a generation, most of the population had died from European diseases. Within a century, the Nahuatl language was barely spoken, and Aztec religious practices had been almost completely suppressed. It was one of the most complete cultural extinctions in recorded history. But in some ways, that extinction was a mercy. The Spanish, for all their own brutality and cultural chauvinism, did put an end to the systematic human sacrifice that had defined Aztec civilization. They did abolish the religious system that had justified the ritual murder of hundreds of thousands of people. Children were no longer drowned to make it rain. Prisoners of war were no longer flayed alive to honor the gods. The Great Pyramids were no longer stained with the blood of daily sacrifices. The god kings who had ruled through fear and religious terror were gone forever. And yet, as we've seen throughout this long, dark journey, the psychological mechanisms that made the Aztec Empire possible didn't die with the last emperor. They're still with us, embedded in human nature itself. The capacity for systematic cruelty justified by higher purposes, the ability to dehumanize others in service of ideological goals, the tendency to suppress doubt and empathy in favor of group loyalty, the willingness to accept atrocities as long as they're committed by people we identify with, for causes we believe in. These traits didn't disappear when Tenochtitlan fell. They just found new expressions in new societies. The Spanish who conquered the Aztecs went on to establish their own systems of systematic oppression, justified by their own religious beliefs. The European powers that followed them created colonial empires that enslaved millions of people in the name of civilization and progress. The 20th century saw ideological systems that killed more people than all the Aztec sacrifices combined, all in the name of racial purity, class struggle, and national greatness. And the 21st century has already shown us that the human capacity for organized cruelty is far from exhausted. So while the Aztec god kings are gone, the questions they raise about human nature, power, and moral responsibility are as relevant as ever. As we come to the end of this journey through one of history's darkest chapters, I want to return to something I mentioned at the beginning. The life of an Aztec god king was disturbing, not just because of the scale of violence involved, but because of how normal that violence seemed to the people who participated in it. These weren't cartoon villains twirling their mustaches while they plotted evil schemes. They were intelligent, sophisticated people who had convinced themselves that systematic murder was a form of religious service. They had elaborate philosophical justifications for their actions. They had complex bureaucratic systems for organizing those actions. They had educational systems that trained new generations to see those actions as normal and necessary. They had created a civilization that could produce beautiful art, sophisticated architecture, advanced mathematics, and precise astronomical observations, while simultaneously running the most elaborate torture-murder operation in human history. And they saw no contradiction between these two aspects of their society. That's what makes their story so disturbing and so important, because it forces us to confront the possibility that we, too, might be participating in systems of organized harm while convincing ourselves that we're good people doing necessary things. It forces us to question our own assumptions about what kinds of suffering are acceptable in service of our own higher purposes. It forces us to examine our own capacity for moral blindness, our own ability to ignore inconvenient truths about the costs of our way of life. The Aztec god kings weren't monsters. They were humans like us, shaped by systems and beliefs that channeled their humanity in monstrous directions. And if they could be shaped that way, so can we. But the same capacity for moral reasoning that allowed the Aztecs to justify their atrocities also gives us the ability to recognize those atrocities for what they were. The same historical perspective that lets us see the horror of their civilization also lets us examine our own civilization more critically. The same human empathy that makes us recoil from their practices also gives us the motivation to build something better. So let me ask you one final question, and this is the one I really want you to think about as you go about your day. If someone from the future were to look back at our civilization the way we look back at the Aztecs, what would they find disturbing about the way we live? What practices that we consider normal would seem obviously wrong to them? What justifications that we find compelling would seem like elaborate self-deception? What forms of suffering that we accept as inevitable would strike them as systematic cruelty disguised as necessity? I don't know the answers to these questions. I suspect that some of our practices that seem most obviously justified to us will seem most obviously wrong to future generations. But I think the questions are worth asking, because if we can't learn from the mistakes of the past, we're doomed to have future generations learn from our mistakes instead. And I'd rather be part of the solution than part of the problem that future historians will puzzle over, wondering how intelligent, sophisticated people could have convinced themselves that their harmful practices were actually good. The Aztec god kings are gone, but the choices they faced between comfortable self-deception and uncomfortable truth, between group loyalty and individual conscience, between maintaining power and acknowledging wrongdoing, those choices are still with us. Every day, in small ways and large ways, we all face the choice between being the kind of people who question harmful systems and the kind of people who participate in them. The Aztecs chose participation. They chose the comfort of certainty over the difficulty of doubt. They chose the maintenance of their system over the welfare of their victims. And in the end, that choice destroyed their entire civilization. We have the benefit of their example. We have the warning of their failure. We have the opportunity to choose differently. The question is, will we? Alright guys, that's a wrap on our deep dive into the disturbing life of Aztec kings. I know this was heavy, and I know it probably raised more questions than it answered. But I think that's exactly what these kinds of historical explorations should do. They should make us uncomfortable enough to think seriously about things we usually take for granted. If this video made you think, hit that like button and let me know in the comments what aspects of this story you found most disturbing or most relevant to our modern world. And if you want more deep dives into the darker aspects of human history, subscribe and hit the notification bell because we're just getting started. Thanks for sticking with me through this journey into one of humanity's darkest chapters. It's not easy material, but I think it's important material. And remember, the goal isn't to make you feel bad about being human. The goal is to make you think more carefully about what it means to be human in a world where humans are capable of both incredible beauty and incredible horror. Until next time, stay curious, stay questioning, and stay human.